Hi everyone, I just wanted to say hello before we get started on our April behind the scenes look for patrons on that tier. For this month, it's a new tool that I set up for myself that I call the continuity log, and some people have things that are more specific than this. It's kind of in the spirit of like a universe Bible, as a lot of creators call it, but it's a little more narrow in the scope. As you can probably fathom, a universe Bible is for literally anything and everything, versus the continuity log kind of reduces the amount of information that's available so that when I'm writing, I don't have to weed through a huge catalog of everything that I've ever said, and I can just stick with the things that are relevant to the events that are happening on the page. And I have something more advanced if I need it. So this is kind of an in-between where I do have some of the elements you might find in a universe Bible. It's not as broad. So the first thing that I did for my sake was to have a table of contents by chapter so I would know what happened when. And this is more convenient for when it starts getting longer and I get into the later chapters and it starts to get a little blurry what exactly happened in chapter 1. And to save myself having to read it in order to understand what I did, I have links here. And what they do is they link to each section. And each section has its own breakdown for scene, details, and plot. So that makes it so I know what I need to do. If you hear any sniffing, it's little Miss Arabella, who has come to investigate the microphone. But first, after that table of contents demonstration there, we have the other slides that are in between that I kind of just flip through really quickly, trying to get back up to them. So the first one I do is like intro details of how these people were first met. And the things about them that are relevant to the reader. So anything like their stance on certain people, phrases they use that are kind of exclusive to them. As you can see with Mari, it's thank the stars. Like, it's things of this nature, the kind of first impression that you would get from this character from their introductions. These are all things that happened before chapter 1, but I want to make sure I keep to them. So, the other thing is specific terminology and for staying consistent with them with different groups. So there are words that can kind of alternate, such as ward or barrier, where I can exchange between the two. And then there's words that are specific and they are limited to that. There's aura, which is, it is what it is. There's no other synonym for it. And there are other ones where I don't have the synonym here because it is exclusive to a group. So while all the people who are out collecting energy are called runners universally, in Genoa they are called caravanners. So we have different things like that. It's not something like ward or barrier where it's interchangeable no matter who you're talking to. This is exclusive to a certain city-state. So that's where I use it. And as you can imagine, when you're typing, it's really easy to get words mixed up, especially when you're getting into a multi-chapter work. This helps keep me from using words in situations where they don't apply. I would never call a ward, refer to it with the aura, because otherwise I'm now confusing the reader and myself as to what's going on. And then there's world building, things that I've said in the chapter that I didn't necessarily decide in advance. It's something that I didn't think of until I was typing it. So for example, in one of the early chapters, they have a fight with Union mages, and it occurred to me that the horses that are pulling their wagons would definitely not be specifically field or travel horses. They would be trained war horses because they're expecting combat and they have the resources to do that. So that was a distinction that I hadn't necessarily thought of until I was sitting in the midst of that chapter going, oh, these horses are probably not just like farm horses. So these are the things that wouldn't necessarily be in a universe Bible because I didn't think about that in advance. I didn't think about it until I was sitting in front of it, which happens more often than a lot of creators lead on. Every time I hear a reader being like, yes, this was my plan all along, or a creator, I should say, or a consumer sometimes talking about a creator like, yes, this was their intent from the start. I'm like, maybe. I believe it with like George R. R. Martin, things like that. Like, okay, you have the clear continuity there, but there are things that you won't know until you are sitting in the thick of it. And it's a discredit to every other starting writer out there if they're like, oh, no, I didn't just plan this whole thing from the start. I'm a horrible writer. No, you're like the rest of us. It's nothing crazy. So anything that comes up on the fly, I put in here so that I don't forget, because otherwise it won't be in the universe Bible. I won't remember that I wrote it 5 months later. And it all goes completely to the wayside and I forget all about it. This makes sure I don't do that. So, and specific union practices, which I made its own thing, some of it's repetition. And that's fine, because if I'm looking for union practices, I wouldn't necessarily go to the world building slide to look for it. So this is just a quick reminder to me that that's what they have, and it goes from there. So, other things that I find really important. This slide is my favorite because this stops me from leaving things hanging by accident. It's one thing to do, the Tiger and the Lady short story where you intentionally left it open. It is another beast completely to forget you mentioned a plot point and never go back to it. So for example, in that same chapter, chapter 1, where they had the fight with the Union mages, there was a blank piece of parchment found on one of the Union people. Now, this one is very easy to forget as a writer, in my opinion, because it was a short offhand discussion, and I could get swept up in the immediate events and completely forget that this piece of parchment even exists if I didn't write it down. So this is where I put everything that I haven't resolved yet to make sure that if I want to leave it unresolved, I've done that with intent. Not because I forgot about the blank piece of parchment and all the readers are like, excuse me, what happened? No, don't want to do that. This is where it goes. And always assume that you're going to have a problem remembering, because there's a lot to remember when you're a writer. Don't be like, oh, I'll remember this. Don't do that to yourself. Put that in here and you'll never forget. Now, back to the layout for chapter basis, chapter by chapter basis. Scene. For me, this is everything that physically happened or is just a fact about it. It's just the quick and dirty version. So it's like, who's there? Are they main or are they minor? Things like the carts are wooden. I don't want to have them suddenly become steel carts in chapter 2. And that's something, again, that's very easy to forget. So, there were 3 Union mages between 2 characters. One died before Lauren woke. Like, these are all things. What happened when? Numbers, descriptions. It's just the physical scene and the time of year and day it is, what year it is, like, just the observations. If I were to make a history summary of what happened, a historical summary of what happened, this is all the information that I would want, essentially. Now, the details are a little more conceptual than anything else, like Dira introducing himself, whereas Noyo and Lauren didn't introduce themselves. He just happened to hear their names as they were talking to one another. So, if I did need to refer to this later on, I wouldn't be sitting there wondering in chapter 6, did Noyo actually give their name to Dira, or did he just extrapolate it? I don't remember. If it did come up. And this is something that the characters would remember easily and that I would remember in a social environment, but in a writing environment, it's very easy to overlook. So that's where these sorts of things come in handy. And the same situation with Lauren had a head injury that was healed by Noyo. I wouldn't want to then attribute that to Dira later. I need to remember what happened. So, scene is like what it looked like. Details are what happened. And plot are the events, and I highlight here what's in the unresolved plot points. These are just the events that happened that are relevant to the overarching plot. Things like character relations. So you have Lauren likes Dira, Noyo doesn't. Just simple things like that, so that I don't suddenly have something shift. I wouldn't want Lauren to suddenly be against Dira in chapter 2, and Noyo is pro Dira, unless I had that planned out in advance. I want to make sure that whatever I introduced here stays consistent unless it is part of the plan. So knowing what happened when will also be really useful for how much time has passed since then, how many chapters. So there's in-canon time and the reader's time. If it happens too fast for the readers, it doesn't feel right. If it happens too fast for the characters, it doesn't feel believable. So that's really where it comes down to. And as far as anything else goes, this is very, very easy to use as a template. You can add different things as you need. You can leave things out as you need. There are going to be chapters where maybe the plot doesn't move forward in any significant way. I would say those are sparing like fluff chapters, but if they didn't, you wouldn't need this slide. Or maybe there's a chapter where you don't really have the scene change all that much, so you don't have to describe anything different. It's all the same as the chapter before it. In the case of like a situation where you're trapped, for example, where the details would change, someone tries to get themselves out and it doesn't work, or anything to that effect, but the scene itself will not. So that's really where you'd want to keep things in mind for this. I would say these three will probably always be there, but they can be taken out if needed or expanded on. If there is something else that happens, for example, if there was like a large significant battle, you might give that battle its own dedicated slide. Think something like the attack on Hogwarts. You would give that its own dedicated slide to state what happened to who and where they were, so that you could remember what went down. Other than that, I hope this is a really useful tool to anyone else who is looking to kind of keep their structure better. Another thing in general that I want to keep in mind, I heard this from someone who was talking to me about plotting, and they had specifically said there, as a quote, from someone I don't remember, that there are writers who are architects and writers who are more gardeners, and their story either evolves and spreads on the wind, or they have intricate blueprints. And he's like, the gist of this quote was that most writers fall somewhere in the middle, so you can alternate between gardener and architect depending on what you're looking for. This is just to help you keep everything in line for yourself, because you go where your creativity goes, but you also need to keep the facts in line. So this is what that performance really helps with here, is that you would be able to remember what it is you did and when you did it, and how it happened, and where you want to go with it. It's all right here so that you don't have to remember it. As a writer, that's what you do. You didn't want to remember, so you wrote it down. In any case, I really hope this helps you, and I hope that it helps you more understand the way that you put your stories together. Whether you are garden, architect, or eldritch being, may your writing always be something you can take pride in, at least knowing that you've learned something. So go out, write, share it or don't. It is yours to enjoy. And I will see you next month.